Did the Wuhan virus pandemic begin in May 2019? Let me repeat that. May 2019, not December 2019. December was when the first cases came to light in China, but the pandemic could have started in China at least 7 months before that, in the month of May. Why do I say so? Because a new report has thrown up some explosive details. Now, Hubei is the province, where Wuhan city is located. And Hubei was buying PCR tests as early as May 2019. Not a small number, but PCR tests worth millions of dollars. I repeat, in May 2019. And we all know that China announced its first confirmed infections only in December. So why were Chinese officials buying so many PCR tests in the month of May? Did they expect an outbreak a few months later? Did they know of any developments or leaks that could lead to an outbreak? Or were they already containing an outbreak? It's hard to say at the moment. Information in China, is very tough to access, and information on how the pandemic began is well nigh impossible to access. Ask the WHO team or the American intelligence agencies. They all conducted investigations into the origins and came up with virtually nothing. Now, these new findings, the ones that we have for you tonight, could change everything. Could tell you how big the cover-up is. What's the source of this? And how reliable is it? What we are talking about tonight is evidence dug up by an Australian cybersecurity agency. And here's what they found. Details of public procurement bids, tenders from Chinese agencies in Hubei. And I have copies of those tenders. They have very, very specific details of quantities, of addresses, locations, company names, delivery periods, warranty periods. These tenders were issued from Chinese agencies in Hubei who wanted to buy PCR test kits. And listen to these numbers. During 2019, Hubei spent more than $10 million on PCR tests. In 2018, Hubei spent a little more than $5 million on PCR tests. So the spending nearly doubled from 2018 to 2019. And there was a sudden spike in orders starting May 2019. The question is, what explains this spike? Who was buying these tests? Chinese universities, Chinese military, and the Chinese Center of Disease Control. Does that sound suspicious? It should, because these are all key stakeholders in Hubei. All of them had an alleged role to play in the beginning of the pandemic. Now look at the pattern. Orders from Chinese universities doubled after May 2019. At the Chinese Center for Disease Control, PCR test purchases jumped by 5 times. At animal testing bureaus, the orders surged by 10 times. The first major purchase order dates back to 27th of May 2019. And what you see on your screen is a copy of that. Look at who the buyer is. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Airborne Hospital. This is the Chinese military, yes. And they bought something called the fluorescent quantitative PCR instrument. It's basically a piece of equipment that is used for PCR testing. Apparently, the Chinese military did not even have to pay for this. The supplier, in this case it was Sinopharm, the supplier ended up gifting the instrument to the military hospital. Sinopharm also makes Chinese vaccines. Now, I know it's a lot to process, but I'm not done with what we have. There are more revelations. We have more details of other agencies buying PCR tests in China. Let me show you. This is a procurement requirement from 22nd September 2019. It's from the Wuhan Hongshan District Center for Disease Control and Prevention. What were they buying? Pathogen detection equipment. Basically machines to detect pathogens like viruses. And they made 2 such purchases. Another similar tender came out on the 6th of November. This time the buyer is a familiar name, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They also bought tests. The same Wuhan lab that is suspected to be a potential source of the virus, they were buying a fluorescent quantitative PCR instrument, the same equipment that the Chinese military bought in May 2019. Now here's something peculiar. For most of us, PCR tests became common only after the pandemic. How many of you knew about a PCR test before the outbreak? They were not mainstream. Although the technology, I must tell you, is quite old. The PCR technique was invented way back in the 1980s. PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. It's a method of testing. And here's how it works. You have a small sample of DNA, a PCR amplifies it, it makes millions of copies of the same sequence, so the sample becomes large enough to study in detail. That essentially is a PCR test. It's 3 decades old, but like I said, it was not mainstream. In China, though, it was. All of this evidence shows that China had large numbers of PCR tests well in advance. The question is why and how? At a time when the world had not even heard of the Wuhan virus, why were Chinese officials buying such a large number of PCR tests? And what do I mean by a large number? Look at the trend. In 2015, Hubei was issuing 52 contracts for PCR equipment. In 2016, 53 contracts, 2017, 72 contracts, 2018, 89, and then in 2019, see the sudden jump in the graph, 135 contracts were issued. It's a jump of more than 50%. Why did Hubei suddenly need so many PCR machines? The pattern is quite clear and the evidence is strong. Chinese officials were buying PCR tests in suspiciously large numbers well before anyone noticed the Wuhan virus outbreak. Now, we do not expect China to answer these patterns or to explain them. Our question is to the global community instead. What will they do about this new evidence? For how long will the world ignore China's cover-up? That is the question, and the choice is very simple. Staying silent and risking another pandemic, or speaking out and making China pay.